The morning light spread across the Amboseli savanna like molten gold, painting the dry grasses and scattered acacia trees in warm hues that James Mitchell had spent 2 decades learning to capture. His Canon EOS R5 felt like an extension of his body, now the familiar weight comforting in his weathered hands as he tracked the elephant herd through his telephoto lens. This was his 3rd day following the group of 12 elephants as they made their way across the vast expanse of Kenya's most famous wildlife conservancy. The migration patterns of these giants had always fascinated him, their ancient wisdom encoded in roots passed down through generations. Today felt different, though charged with an anticipation he couldn't quite explain. Through the 600mm lens, James observed the familiar hierarchy of the herd. The matriarch, a massive female with distinctive notches in her left ear, led the procession with the confident gait of one who had navigated these lands for over 4 decades. Behind her, the other adults followed in loose formation, their young ones safely tucked between massive gray bodies. But something was wrong with the formation. James lowered his camera and squinted against the morning glare. One small figure lagged significantly behind the group, struggling to keep pace with the steady rhythm of the herd. At first glance, it appeared to be simply a young elephant, perhaps tired from the night's journey. But as James raised his camera again and adjusted the focus, the details that emerged made him catch his breath. The young elephant was unlike anything he had ever seen in 20 years of African wildlife photography. Its skin was not the typical dusty gray of its companions, but rather a pale pink white that seemed to glow in the morning light. Even more striking were its eyes, a pale blue that spoke of the genetic rarity James was witnessing. This was an albino elephant calf, probably no more than 2 years old, and it was clearly struggling. James had heard stories of albino elephants whispered around campfires by old rangers and native guides. They were considered sacred by some local tribes, cursed by others, but universally acknowledged as extraordinarily rare. In his entire career, he had never encountered one, and he knew the odds of survival for such animals in the wild were devastatingly low. The calf stopped frequently, its breathing labored and visible even from James's distant vantage point. The sensitive skin that gave it its unique appearance was clearly a liability under the African sun, and its smaller stature suggested developmental challenges that often accompanied albinism. Most heartbreaking of all was the way it kept trying to catch up to its family, taking several quick steps before having to pause again to rest. James found himself faced with the fundamental dilemma that had shaped his entire philosophy as a wildlife photographer. The basic tenet of his profession, drilled into him by mentors and reinforced by decades of experience, was simple: observe, don't interfere. The moment humans intervened in natural processes, they risked disrupting delicate ecological balances that had evolved over millions of years. But watching the small albino calf struggle, James felt his resolve wavering. Should he contact the Kenya Wildlife Service rangers? The calf was clearly in distress, and medical intervention might save its life. The Conservancy had veterinary teams trained in elephant care, and they could potentially provide the support this unique animal needed to survive. Yet James also knew the potential consequences of intervention. If rangers arrived with vehicles and medical equipment, the entire herd might scatter in panic. Elephants had long memories and complex social structures. Separating the calf from its family, even temporarily, could cause psychological trauma that might affect it for life. Worse, if the family abandoned the area entirely, they might miss crucial water sources or feeding grounds in the challenging months ahead. As James watched, something remarkable began to unfold. The matriarch, who had been leading the herd steadily forward, suddenly stopped and turned back toward the struggling calf. Without any audible communication that James could detect, the entire herd halted. The matriarch began walking back her massive form, moving with surprising grace and purpose. When she reached the albino calf, the matriarch gently extended her trunk, touching the small elephant's back in what appeared to be a gesture of encouragement. Another female, possibly the calf's mother, approached from the other side. Together, these 2 adults flanked the young albino, providing both physical support and emotional comfort. James raised his camera, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the settings. ISO 400 to handle the changing light aperture at f5.6 for optimal depth of field shutter speed at 1,000th of a second to freeze any movement. This was exactly the kind of moment that defined his career. Raw, authentic wildlife behavior that revealed the deep emotional intelligence of these magnificent creatures. The scene that unfolded challenged everything James thought he knew about natural selection and survival of the fittest. Rather than abandoning their weakest member, the herd was adapting to accommodate the albino calf's limitations. The pace of the entire group slowed to match what the small elephant could manage. The positioning shifted so that the calf was protected in the center, shielded from the harsh sun by the massive bodies of its family members. For several hours, James documented this extraordinary display of elephant empathy. The matriarch would periodically check on the calf, her ancient eyes seeming to assess its condition with the wisdom of decades. The mother never left its side, using her own body to create shade during rest stops. Even some of the other young elephants in the herd began to show protective behaviors, forming a loose circle around their albino companion during breaks. As the day wore on, James found himself deeply conflicted. The logical part of his brain recognized that this could be merely a temporary delay in the inevitable. The calf was clearly struggling, and the challenges ahead. The approaching dry season potential predator encounters the daily demands of long-distance travel seemed insurmountable for an animal with such obvious physical disadvantages. But another part of him, the part that had been shaped by decades of witnessing nature's incredible adaptability, wondered if he was underestimating both the calf's resilience and the herd's capacity for accommodation. Perhaps intervention would actually disrupt a natural healing process that was already underway. Maybe the elephant family's instincts were more sophisticated than human understanding could appreciate. The internal debate raged as James continued to document the herd's journey. Every photograph captured not just the visual reality of an extraordinary albino elephant, but also the complex emotional and social dynamics that were playing out before his lens. This wasn't simply a story about a genetic anomaly struggling to survive. It was a testament to the power of family bonds and collective caring in the animal kingdom. As the sun reached its zenith, the herd found shelter under a cluster of large acacia trees near a small waterhole. The albino calf collapsed into the shade with obvious relief, its pale skin already showing signs of sunburn despite the protection provided by its family. The mother elephant immediately positioned herself to provide additional shade, while the matriarch kept watch over the surrounding area. James made his decision. He would continue to observe and document, but he would not call for human intervention, at least not yet. The herd had shown remarkable wisdom and adaptability in their care for the albino calf. They deserved the chance to solve this challenge in their own way according to their own ancient knowledge. But as he packed his equipment for the day and prepared to return to camp, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was possibly making a terrible mistake. The weight of responsibility felt overwhelming. In his hands lay the power to potentially save a life, yet also to potentially destroy the very thing he was trying to preserve. The albino calf's pale blue eyes seemed to follow him as he prepared to leave, and James wondered what intelligence lay behind that gaze. Did the young elephant understand its unique circumstances? Could it sense the precarious nature of its existence, or was it simply focused on the moment-to-moment challenge of staying with its family? That night in his tent, James stared at the images on his camera's LCD screen. Each photograph told part of a story that was still being written. The stark beauty of the albino calf contrasted against the typical gray of its companions, the tender interactions between family members, the determined expression on the matriarch's weathered face as she assessed the group's newest challenge. These images could potentially change conservation approaches worldwide. They documented a level of elephant social intelligence and empathy that researchers had theorized but rarely captured so dramatically. But they also raised uncomfortable questions about when, if ever, humans should intervene in natural processes. As James drifted off to sleep, to the sound of distant elephant rumbles carried on the night wind, he knew that the next few days would test not only the albino calf's ability to survive, but also his own conviction that nature knows best. The story was just beginning, and its conclusion was far from certain. The first day had ended with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear: James was witnessing something extraordinary. Whether it would ultimately be a story of triumph or tragedy remained to be seen, but it would undoubtedly be a story worth telling. Dawn broke with the same golden intensity as the previous day, but James awoke with a knot of anxiety in his stomach that had been growing since he first spotted the albino calf. He had spent a restless night replaying scenarios, each more troubling than the last. What if the calf hadn't survived the night? What if the herd had moved on without it? What if his decision not to intervene had already proven fatal? With practiced efficiency born of countless early mornings in the field, James prepared his gear and set out with his local guide Mwangi to relocate the elephant herd. Mwangi had worked in Amboseli for over 15 years and possessed an almost mystical ability to track wildlife across the vast savanna. His weathered face remained impassive as James explained the situation, but his eyes betrayed the same concern that was eating at the photographer. They followed the trail of massive footprints, scattered dung, and broken vegetation that marked the herd's passage through the night. After an hour of careful tracking, they spotted the elephants near a larger waterhole about 3 kilometers from where James had left them the previous evening. Raising his binoculars, James quickly counted the familiar silhouettes. 12 elephants, all accounted for. Relief flooded through him as he spotted the distinctive pale form of the albino calf lying in the shade of its mother. The young elephant was alive, though it appeared even more lethargic than the day before. Through his telephoto lens, James could see that the calf's breathing was shallow and rapid, its pale skin showing more pronounced signs of sun damage despite the family's protective efforts. The herd's behavior had evolved overnight in ways that fascinated James. The usual loose formation had tightened into something more protective. The adult females had positioned themselves in a rough circle around the waterhole, with the albino calf and its mother at the center. Several elephants took turns creating shade with their massive ears fanning the air in coordinated efforts to keep the vulnerable calf cool. James spent the morning documenting these adaptive behaviors using his 800mm lens to maintain distance while capturing intimate details of the family's care routines. The matriarch, whom James had begun calling Temba in his field notes, seemed to have assumed the role of primary caregiver alongside the calf's mother. She regularly approached the young albino, using her trunk to gently touch and examine it as if conducting medical assessments with 40 years of accumulated wisdom. Around midday, when the sun's intensity was at its peak, something remarkable happened. The entire herd began a coordinated mud-wallowing session, but with a specific focus on their albino member. Adult elephants would scoop up mud with their trunks and carefully apply it to the calf's exposed skin, creating a natural sunscreen from the mineral-rich earth. The process was deliberate and methodical, with different family members taking turns to ensure complete coverage. James had witnessed mud-bathing behavior countless times, but never with this level of focused intention. The elephants seemed to understand instinctively that their albino family member needed special protection, and they were providing it using their own intelligence and resources. It was a masterclass in collective problem-solving that challenged conventional understanding of animal cognition. Throughout the second day, James also began to notice subtle changes in the calf's condition. While still obviously struggling, the young elephant seemed marginally stronger than the day before. It was drinking more frequently, taking advantage of the constant access to water that its family was providing. More importantly, it was beginning to show increased interest in its surroundings, occasionally lifting its head to observe the other elephants or investigate interesting scents. The protective mud coating appeared to be effective. The angry red patches of sunburned skin that James had noted the previous day were beginning to heal, and new applications of mud were preventing further damage. The herd's collective wisdom was proving more effective than many human interventions might have been. By the third day, James began to see the first signs of real improvement. The albino calf was standing for longer periods and even attempting to play with some of the other young elephants in the group. Its movements were still careful and deliberate, lacking the boisterous energy typical of elephant calves its age, but the improvement was undeniable. Most encouraging was the development of what James came to think of as a buddy system within the herd. A young female elephant, probably the albino calf's older sister, had taken on a protective role that went beyond what the adults were providing. She stayed close during travel, helped guide the calf to the best feeding spots, and even seemed to be teaching it how to apply mud more effectively to its own skin. James captured a particularly moving sequence on the afternoon of the third day, the albino calf and its protective sister standing side by side at the water's edge, their trunks intertwined as they drank. The contrast between the pale pink-white of the albino and the normal gray of its companion created a powerful visual metaphor for family acceptance and unconditional love. The photographer found himself developing an emotional attachment to this story that went beyond professional interest. Each morning brought anxiety about what he might find, and each evening brought relief when the calf proved its continued resilience. He began to understand the profound responsibility that comes with being a witness to such intimate natural dramas. On the fourth day, the herd faced their first real test. Water levels at their current location were dropping rapidly, and the elephants needed to move to a more reliable source several kilometers away. James watched through his telephoto lens as the matriarch surveyed the group, her intelligent eyes seeming to weigh the risks of travel against the necessity of finding better resources. The decision when it came was swift and decisive. The herd would move, but with modifications to their usual travel pattern. Instead of the typical single-file formation, they arranged themselves in a protective diamond shape with the albino calf at the center. The matriarch led from the front while the mother and the protective sister flanked the calf on either side. Other adults formed a mobile shield around this core group. The journey that followed was unlike anything James had documented in his career. The elephants moved with deliberate slowness, stopping frequently to allow the albino calf to rest. During these breaks, the mud application ritual was repeated, ensuring continuous protection from the sun. When the calf showed signs of fatigue, multiple adults would surround it, creating a moving oasis of shade and support. Most remarkably, the herd's pace never felt forced or resentful. There was no sense that the adults were being held back by their weakest member. Instead, the entire dynamic of the group had shifted to accommodate the albino calf's needs while maintaining the collective well-being of all members. The journey took nearly 6 hours to complete what would normally be a 2-hour trek. But when they arrived at the new waterhole, a large permanent source with abundant shade and fresh vegetation, the success of their strategy was evident. The albino calf had not only survived the journey but seemed to have grown stronger from it. James documented the arrival with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal relief. His photographs captured not just the physical reality of an extraordinary elephant family, but also the emotional truth of their collective triumph. The albino calf was no longer a burden to be carried, but a full member of the family whose unique needs had been successfully integrated into the group's survival strategy. On the 5th and 6th days, James witnessed what could only be described as the calf's integration into normal herd life. While still requiring special care and protection, the young albino began participating more actively in typical elephant activities. It learned to dust itself with dry earth for additional sun protection, developed preferences for certain types of vegetation, and even began showing playful behaviors with other calves in the group. The photographer found himself revising his understanding of what normal meant in the context of elephant society. The herd hadn't simply accommodated the albino calf. They had evolved their entire social structure to create a new normal that included and celebrated difference. It was a lesson in adaptive flexibility that many human communities could learn from. James also began to notice his own transformation during this extended observation period. The initial panic and urge to intervene had given way to deep respect for the elephant's collective wisdom. He had learned to trust processes that initially seemed uncertain or risky, recognizing that his human perspective was often limited compared to the accumulated knowledge of these ancient creatures. The 7th day brought an unexpected challenge that would test both the herd's protective strategies and James's commitment to non-interference. A pride of lions had moved into the area, and while they typically avoided confrontations with adult elephants, the presence of a vulnerable calf might change their calculus. James watched through his lens as the matriarch detected the lion's scent and immediately signaled alarm to the rest of the herd. The response was swift and coordinated. Adults formed a tight defensive circle with all the young elephants, including the albino calf, protected at the center. The display was impressive, a wall of gray flesh and ivory that presented an intimidating barrier to any potential predator. The lions, apparently recognizing the futility of challenging such a formidable defense, moved on without incident. But the event reinforced James's growing conviction that the albino calf was not just surviving but thriving under its family's protection. The herd had proven capable of adapting their protective strategies to meet any threat. As the first week of observation drew to a close, James reflected on the profound changes he had witnessed, not just in the albino calf's condition, but in his own understanding of wildlife photography's role and responsibility. He had entered this situation believing that non-interference was a rigid principle to be followed regardless of circumstances. Now he understood it as a more nuanced commitment to trust natural processes while remaining alert to situations where intervention might truly be necessary. The albino calf had transformed from a struggling, isolated individual into a valued member of a family that had reorganized itself around inclusion and protection. It was a story of resilience, adaptation, and unconditional love that transcended species boundaries. And James had been privileged to witness and document it all. But he also knew that the most challenging tests were yet to come. The dry season was approaching. Resources would become scarcer, and the herd would face decisions about long-term survival that might test even their remarkable capacity for accommodation. The story was far from over, and its ultimate conclusion remained uncertain. The reality of leaving hit James with unexpected force on his final morning in Amboseli. 3 weeks that had felt like a lifetime of discovery were coming to an end, and with them, his role as witness to one of the most extraordinary wildlife stories of his career. His contract with National Geographic required him to move on to Botswana for the next phase of a Pan-African elephant migration study, but his heart remained anchored to this specific family and their remarkable albino member. James rose before dawn, driven by a familiar mixture of excitement and melancholy that came with endings. This would be his last opportunity to observe the herd, his final chance to document the albino calf's continued progress. As he prepared his equipment in the pre-dawn darkness, he reflected on how much both he and the elephants had changed since that first dramatic encounter. The transformation in the albino calf was nothing short of miraculous. What had begun as a struggling, isolated young elephant barely able to keep pace with its family had evolved into a confident, integrated member of the herd. The pale pink-white skin that had initially seemed like a fatal liability now appeared almost luminous in the early morning light, a badge of uniqueness rather than vulnerability. Through his telephoto lens, James watched the familiar morning routine that had become precious to him over the past weeks. The herd was preparing for another day of travel, but their movements now incorporated the albino calf's needs so seamlessly that the accommodations appeared completely natural. The mud application ritual had become as routine as drinking water, and the protective positioning during travel had evolved into an elegant dance of family cooperation. Most remarkably, the albino calf had developed its own sophisticated understanding of its limitations and how to work within them. It had learned to seek shade proactively, to apply protective mud with impressive skill for its age, and to communicate its needs to family members through subtle body language and trunk gestures. The young elephant was not just surviving. It was developing into an intelligent, capable individual with its own personality and preferences. James found himself particularly moved by the relationship that had developed between the albino calf and its protective older sister. What had begun as a necessity-driven guardianship had evolved into a genuine friendship that enriched both elephants' lives. They played together, explored together, and had developed a communication style that seemed almost telepathic in its efficiency. As the morning progressed, James realized he was witnessing more than just successful adaptation. He was observing evolution in action. This family had developed new social behaviors and protective strategies that could potentially be passed down to future generations. The albino calf's presence had catalyzed innovations in elephant social organization that might influence the entire herd's approach to caring for vulnerable members. The matriarch Temba had emerged as a central figure in this transformation. Her leadership had been crucial in establishing the new social norms that protected the albino calf while maintaining the herd's overall effectiveness. James had watched her make countless micro-decisions over the weeks, each one balancing the needs of the individual against the welfare of the group. Her wisdom and experience had been the foundation upon which the family's successful adaptation was built. Around midday, James faced the inevitable moment of final documentation. He wanted to capture one last image that would encapsulate the entire story he had witnessed. Using his wide-angle lens, he positioned himself to frame the entire herd with the dramatic backdrop of Mount Kilimanjaro in the distance. The composition that emerged was breathtaking. 12 elephants moving across the golden savanna in perfect formation, with the albino calf proudly walking in the center of the group, no longer a burden, but a treasured family member. The symbolic power of that final image was overwhelming. Against the backdrop of Africa's highest peak, these elephants represented the summit of family loyalty, adaptive intelligence, and unconditional love. The albino calf's pale form at the center of the dark gray group created a visual metaphor for acceptance and inclusion that transcended species boundaries. As James lowered his camera for the final time, he felt a profound sense of completion mixed with inevitable sadness. He had set out to document elephant migration patterns and had instead discovered a story of courage, adaptation, and the transformative power of family bonds. His photographs would preserve this remarkable journey, but they could never fully capture the emotional complexity of what he had witnessed. The drive back to Nairobi provided time for reflection that James both welcomed and dreaded. As the familiar landscape of Amboseli disappeared in his rearview mirror, he found himself processing not just what he had observed, but how the experience had changed his fundamental understanding of wildlife photography's purpose and responsibility. His laptop contained thousands of images that documented every phase of the albino calf's integration into the herd. Looking through them chronologically was like watching a masterclass in resilience and adaptation. The early photos showed struggle and uncertainty. The later ones revealed confidence and belonging. The progression was more dramatic than any fictional story could have invented. But the real revelation was in the subtle changes visible in the other elephants. The family had not simply accommodated their albino member, they had been enriched by the experience. The protective behaviors they had developed had strengthened bonds throughout the herd. The problem-solving strategies they had invented had enhanced their collective intelligence. The albino calf had given them the opportunity to discover capacities they might never have known they possessed. James began to understand that his role had been more significant than he had initially realized. By choosing not to intervene, he had allowed a natural process of adaptation and growth to unfold uninterrupted. His patience and trust in the elephant's wisdom had been rewarded with insights that could influence conservation approaches worldwide. However, questions continued to nag at him as Nairobi's skyline appeared on the horizon. Had he been right to trust nature's processes so completely? What if circumstances had been different? What if the herd had not possessed such remarkable adaptive capacity? The weight of those unanswered questions would probably stay with him for the rest of his career. The transition back to urban civilization felt jarring after 3 weeks of intimate connection with the natural world. James's small hotel room near the airport felt cramped and artificial compared to the vast openness of the savannah. The constant noise of traffic replaced the subtle soundscape of elephant rumbles, bird calls, and wind through acacia trees. At the airport, while waiting for his flight to London and then on to Botswana, James received an email that would test his convictions one final time. It was from the chief ranger of Amboseli National Park, a man James had met briefly during his initial permit application process. James, the email read, "We've received reports of an albino elephant calf in the area where you've been working. This is obviously an extremely rare and significant discovery. We'd like to coordinate with our research team to establish monitoring protocols and possibly implement protective measures. Could you share any information about the animal's location and condition?" James stared at the message for a long time, his cursor hovering over the reply button. This was exactly the moment he had been dreading, the point where his documentation of the albino calf might lead to the very human interference he had worked so hard to avoid. On one hand, sharing information could help ensure the calf's long-term survival. The rangers had access to veterinary expertise, tracking technology, and protective resources that could prove invaluable if challenges arose. Their intentions were undoubtedly good, driven by genuine conservation concerns and scientific interest. On the other hand, any official intervention might disrupt the delicate social equilibrium that the herd had worked so hard to achieve. The albino calf was thriving under its family's care, and outside interference might be seen as a threat that could scatter the herd or undermine the natural protective strategies they had developed. James closed his laptop without responding. This decision, like so many others over the past 3 weeks, would require careful consideration and moral deliberation. He needed time to weigh the potential consequences and consider what would truly serve the albino calf's best interests. During the long flight to London, James found himself returning repeatedly to one particular photograph, the albino calf looking directly into his camera lens, its pale blue eyes seeming to hold a depth of understanding that defied scientific explanation. In that gaze, James saw not vulnerability or a plea for help, but dignity and acceptance. The young elephant appeared to understand its place in the world, unique, cherished, and protected by family bonds that transcended physical differences. It had found its own way to thrive within the constraints of its condition, supported by a community that had risen to meet the challenges his presence created. Perhaps that was the real lesson James had learned during his time in Amboseli. Not every story required a human hero or intervention to reach a satisfactory conclusion. Sometimes the greatest service he could provide was simply to witness and document to trust in processes that had been refined over millions of years of evolution. As his plane descended through the clouds toward London, James realized that his 3 weeks with the albino elephant had taught him as much about himself as about his subjects. He had discovered the courage to resist the urge to control the wisdom, to trust in natural processes, and the humility to recognize that his human perspective was just one small part of a much larger and more complex story. The albino calf's story would continue long after James's cameras had stopped recording. Seasons would change, challenges would arise, and new adaptations would be required. But the foundation of love, acceptance, and collective wisdom that the herd had established would endure, providing a template for how communities, whether elephant or human, could embrace difference and transform challenges into opportunities for growth. In his hotel room that night, James finally opened his laptop and began composing his response to the ranger's email. His fingers moved slowly across the keyboard as he chose each word carefully, knowing that his decision would influence not just the albino calf's future, but potentially the entire philosophy of wildlife conservation in protected areas. In nature, he wrote, pausing to consider the weight of each word, there are no perfect choices. Only the choice to respect natural processes and live with the consequences of that trust. Sometimes the greatest protection we can offer is the space to solve problems without our interference. The final paragraph took him an hour to compose. The albino calf is thriving under its family's care, having been fully integrated into the herd's social structure through remarkable adaptive behaviors. I believe our role should be to monitor from a respectful distance while allowing these natural protective processes to continue uninterrupted. The story is still being written, and its authors are far wiser than we might initially assume. James attached a single photograph to his email, the wide shot of the entire herd with the albino calf walking confidently in the center, protected and cherished by its family. No words could capture the story's complexity as effectively as that one image of acceptance, adaptation, and unconditional love. As he pressed send and closed his laptop for the night, James felt a deep sense of peace. He had learned to trust not only in the elephant's wisdom, but in his own ability to make difficult decisions based on respect for natural processes rather than human anxiety. The albino calf had given him a gift that would influence every future project, the understanding that sometimes the most powerful intervention is the decision not to intervene at all. The story would continue in the vast savannas of Amboseli, written by trunk and footprint, by mud and shade, by the ancient wisdom of elephants, who understood that true strength comes not from perfection, but from the willingness to adapt, protect, and love unconditionally. And somewhere in those sun-drenched grasslands, a pale young elephant would continue to thrive, living proof that nature's solutions are often more elegant and effective than anything human intervention could provide.